Alrighty, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 11 of constitutional law, hurtling towards the end of term, just 2 more weeks to go. Um, Really important week this week, looking at implied rights and especially focusing on the implied freedom of political communication. This is an area of law that is uh, really developing and in terms of constitutional law, it's so broadly the most recently developed part of thinking about interpreting the Constitution and understanding the Constitution. So, to the extent that constitutional law has a cutting edge, given that it moves quite slowly, this is kind of where we're at. So it's an exciting place to be. Um, Quick bit of housekeeping before we get into tonight's topic, and that's to just briefly raise a few points about the end of term exam, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. We've talked previously in the tutorials about the rough mechanics of how that will work. You'll log into a Zoom session. You'll show your ID, and that'll all be checked off. And then for the duration of the exam, uh, you'll need to have your camera on and keep the sound on, and that's so that the invigilators will be able to basically just make sure that you're not communicating with other people and getting help with your exam. I've got today. I got the links to the Zoom sessions, so I'll be able to pass those on. Basically, the way it'll work is I'll try and figure out what's the simplest way to follow, but breaking you up by into sort of alphabetical sections. I just need to I'm waiting to hear back from the accessibility team about a few exams that will have different timings. But once I've done that, I've got all the links. I'll be able to post those up on Moodle and share that. I'll probably send out an email to each group, so you'll get an email with the link that you should use. And then in next week's tutorial, I'll share my screen and I can show you where on Moodle you'll be able to find it and that sort of stuff as well. So just being aware that that's the process. And so the exam starts at 9, but you'll probably need to try and log in about 10-15 minutes earlier, just to make sure that we've got you in the right room with the right list, and we can check the IDs and all that sort of thing, so that we've got a nice smooth start at the 9 o'clock start off. So that's the logistics. Next week we'll talk a bit more about some final tips and strategies and planning your time in the exam and that sort of stuff. But were there any questions at the moment about the exam? No, that's great to see. I've had a few questions via email about the topics that are accessible. So those are listed in Moodle, but it's basically judicial powers under the Constitution, so both federal and state level, express rights, implied rights, and constitutional change. Those are the 5 potentially accessible topics. The exam won't, you're not going to get a question on all of those things, but those are the topics that you need to be prepared for, because that's what's potentially accessible. But yeah, other than that, if you've got questions, please do feel free to email me or pop them up on Teams, and we can address that as we go. And then, as I say, next week we'll talk a little bit more about that revision and preparation and sort of on the day tips and strategies and those sorts of things. But other than that, we've got tonight's topic looking at implied constitutional rights and in particular focusing on the implied freedom of political communication. So one of the things that has been a more recent development in this space has been this idea of structured proportionality. And it's something that we talked about last week in relation to Section 92 and the Palmer case. But it's also where all that discussion came from initially was its use in the implied freedom of political communication. So if you haven't had a chance already, I'd really encourage you to have a look at the textbook chapter on this particular topic, and in particular, from memory, it's page 261 or 2 to about 265. I've posted just that snippet up on Moodle because I know that some of you have been using the old textbook, which up until now has pretty much been completely fine because the law hasn't changed all that much in a lot of instances. But this is the one area where there has been significant development in the past. How long ago was 2015? 8 years ago. So really making sure that you're up to speed. And so I've put those particular pages from the textbook up on Moodle. So if you haven't had a chance already, make sure you definitely read that. And you can access the textbook as a whole via the library as well if you want to read on and read that updated chapter in its entirety. But the really critical 3 or 4 pages are up on Moodle too. And so the key thing where we're thinking about structured proportionality, and my comments last week stand here as well, is that we're in this really awkward position where the adoption of structured proportionality is comparatively recent, and the High Court justices who were really advocating for the use of structured proportionality have since either left the High Court or are about to leave the High Court. And so it's not necessarily clear looking forward whether structured proportionality will continue to be the preferred approach, or whether we'll go back to a test that looks more like the test that was formulated in Lang. So, and your textbook is quite critical of structured proportionality. I think to a degree they overblow the critique, but they make some fair enough points around. It's not necessarily a better approach than the Lang test that had come before. And so what does that mean for us as constitutional law students, as trying to come up with potentially an exam answer, certainly tonight trying to come up with a tutorial answer? We're going to follow a similar approach to what we did last week, where we recognize that structured proportionality is currently the preferred approach, but also incorporating elements of the previous test into our answers, just to showcase that we know the nuance here, we know completely what's going on, and if down the line, if the court starts to move away from structured proportionality, our understanding of constitutional interpretation is ready to adapt to that new paradigm if it does eventuate. So we'll be thinking, and so you remember last week I sort of gave you that flow chart to work through structured proportionality. That applies very much to this week as well. And then I've done up, this one's not on Moodle yet, but I'll post that up with the recording. I've done up as well something that might help you plan an answer. Let's say in an exam, you can set out your answers to the structured proportionality approach, and then set out the way that you'd address those issues under the previous test from Lang, and then you can sort of, then it's all on the one page. You can make an easy comparison. And you can use that to inform an answer that you're writing. So we'll use this as sort of a basis for framing our discussion this evening in relation to the tutorial question. But before we dive into that, because I think it's one of those things that will really benefit from going through the nuance and having a practical example. But before we do that, are there any questions or clarifications that anyone would be looking for in relation to the implied freedom of political communication?
Yes, Jacob, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
The implied right only covers communication on political matters and not other types of speech. This is Cunliffe and Commonwealth case, and not other types of speech. On the other hand, we have freedom of communication, at least in relation to public affairs and political discussion. That's Australian Capital Television and Commonwealth. So we need somehow to reconcile those two cases. Is it only political discussion or public affairs as well? Because it will affect our analysis.
Yeah, that's a good question. And really what it comes down to is, and again, I think that tonight's tutorial question will highlight a lot of the nuance here, is this interesting gray area in the sense that a lot of what is public is potentially political, even if it's not necessarily something that's turned into a political issue in the sense that like the two major parties are arguing about it or disagreeing with it. So you're right that the implied freedom attaches to political communication, but the way that we understand what sort of communication can be regarded as political is quite broad, and it can apply to these matters of public interest, public affairs, and the reason being potentially government policy affects whatever the issues are being discussed. And again, we'll see the practical example of that in tonight's tutorial. But yeah, the idea is that it can be conceived relatively broadly. There's got to be some political element to it, but we can understand political as sort of covering large swathes of what would be of interest to the general public or have some sort of public element to it. The other, I suppose, angle or type of discussion that does get covered attaches to people who hold public office. And again, the idea is that it's, these are people who are making decisions that affect citizens or acting in some representative capacity for citizens. And so the way that they conduct themselves or the way that they're making decisions is something that in a healthy and rigorous democracy we should be able to freely discuss. So in terms of reconciling the cases, you can afford to take a fairly broad approach, and the idea is that we're looking for some degree of public interest in the discussion. It's not necessarily it's not necessarily a super helpful way of thinking about it, but the idea is this something that would benefit a healthy democracy to have a discussion about this thing? And if it is, then it's something that should be protected. Does that make sense? Yeah, we'll talk through the example as well, and I think that'll highlight some of it too. Any other questions? No, fantastic. Well, let's dive into tonight's question, and then we can.
Just a moment, Jacob.
Oh, sorry.
I have a question. Are those terms interchangeable? Political communication and freedom of political speech?
No.
Or one encompasses another.
Yes. So speech is a form of communication, but it's not the only form of communication. And so this is where we get things like protests or just sort of blockading a street or standing outside of Parliament House can communicate a message without it necessarily being a spoken one. So yeah, it's the freedom attaches to political communication, which covers speech but covers other things as well.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Cool. Alrighty. So tonight's tutorial question, we've got the Commercial Broadcasting Act, in which the Minister for Communications stated that the object is to protect public health by restricting the sale of harmful and addictive substances. Some of the important provisions: Section 3, no person or corporation shall broadcast a range of broadcasting or publishing forms. Any advertisement, information, or matter that pertains to the sale or consumption of products containing tobacco, alcohol, prairie grass. Section 4, no person shall form or become a member of an association that has among its objectives the promotion or appreciation of tobacco, alcohol, or prairie grass. And Section 5, if you contravene those sections, you're guilty of an offence punishable with a fine. The president of the Alternative Medical Practitioners Association holds this opinion that prairie grass is good for you. She goes on the 630 project to defend that position, and it's broadcast. She has a bit of an exchange with one of the interviewers, and she describes the act as the latest draconian intervention in the life of free people by the crypto-fascist Minister for Communications, masquerading as a social reformer and moral crusader. She then storms off, conducts an impromptu march on the streets, and that causes a bit of an issue. So Channel 99, who runs the 630 project, is prosecuted for contravening Section 3, and they're also sued for defamation. And then the president and the other marchers are prosecuted under Section 4. They're also prosecuted under Section 10 of the Public Safety Act, which makes it an offence to conduct marches on public roads without the written authority of the police commissioner. So we're interested in whether Channel 99 and the president, what advice we can give them. And so specifically in the context of this week, we're thinking about the implied freedom of political communication. So what we'll do, I'll get some initial thoughts and comments and reactions from you. Then we'll consolidate some of those ideas in that table that I showed you, breaking down the structured proportionality approach and the Lang test. And then we can have a look at how we might formulate that in or structure that in regards to an exam answer. So just some initial brainstorming first. What caught your eye in relation to this question?
We have here broadcasting of a professional opinion about beneficial impact on health of prairie grass. And this is communication relating to public affairs. And apparently Channel 99 has a freedom of such communication. That's the initial thought.
Okay, yep. So focusing in particular on Channel 99 and their role in this as a media organization, and in particular this, I suppose, the idea that there might be health benefits from the prairie grass, and the way that the discussion went was, I don't know, we could say maybe in a positive direction in the sense that what was discussed were health benefits. Yeah. What else? What do we think of, let's say, the um, the comment that the the Minister for Communications is a crypto fascist, um, masquerading as a social reformer and moral crusader. And
We're thinking about defamatory matter here. Is this a defamation? And if yes, what are possible defenses?
yep. So thinking about potential defamation and then also thinking about how the implied freedom interacts with potentially defamatory content. Yep. What about and going to Vladislav's earlier point about, where do we, how do we decide what communication is political communication? Do we think that discussion of products containing tobacco, alcohol, or prairie grass, would that be political communication?
For me, it was clearly the case because I used Australian Capital Television and Commonwealth, and exactly the wording I've cited, at least in relation to public affairs and political discussion. So I distinguished public affairs from political discussion, but according to you, political communication is much broader concept, which may encompass political affairs as well.
Yes.
But anyway,
Yeah.
to my mind, political affairs is what we need to be guided by saying that this is professional opinion, not from a bystander, but from a professional person about beneficial impact on health of these grass and potentially relating to the public at large, to public affairs.
Yeah. So so there's an interesting point there, right? In terms of this is a professional doctor making comment within, something that is presumably within the realm of her expertise. But we don't necessarily need to go, even if she wasn't a professional, we could still regard this as political communication. And the key point here, and the key way that we can recognize it, is that this is an issue that has been legislated, right? The Act seeks to regulate the sale and consumption and discussion about these products. And so the idea is that in a healthy democracy, we should be able to comment on that policy decision and have a discussion about that policy decision, right? Why has the government taken that approach? Do we think it's the right approach? Do we disagree with it? All of these conversations and ideas ought to be protected within a thriving democracy. And so it's the public interest or being a matter of a public affair or political communication derives from the fact that this is a piece of legislation that's been passed by the government that's trying to impose some kind of restriction and regulation. And so we ought to be able to discuss that and have a conversation about that. We should be able to communicate about that issue. And so in the moment, if there was a problem, the government could be made aware of that or made aware of the diverse views. But more importantly, and this comes back to kind of the core of the implied right, deriving from the sections 7 and 24, this idea that members of the legislature should be chosen by the people, is that it should be an informed choice. We should be able to have these conversations so that when the government goes back up for re-election, we can decide whether they deserve to be elected or not. At the heart of it, that's where all this is coming from, or that's what the justification is. And so in this instance, yeah, I think we'd have no trouble saying that this would be political communication. Any other thoughts? What do we think about the marching in the streets?
Think here about guarantee which extends to conduct, that actions alone may amount to constitutionally protected communication.
Yep, absolutely. So when we think about Levy in Victoria or Brown in Tasmania, the court has been very much willing to recognise that protests or physical demonstrations can very much constitute political communication. And so these are all forms of communication that potentially are protected under the freedom of political communication. And so, and the reason why I say potentially is because everything that we've been discussing here, I think very rightly, is political communication and it could be protected. But the court has also been willing to recognize that there can be restrictions, right? It's not an absolute freedom. Parliament can legitimately restrict political communication. And the question for us is whether that is, and this is where we get to the distinction between structured proportionality and the earlier Lang test, is whether under structured proportionality, ultimately we're thinking about is do they get the balance right? Is it adequate in its balance, the restriction versus the legitimate public ends or objectives that the restriction tries to achieve? Or under the Lang test, are those restrictions reasonably appropriate and adapted to the aim or objective that's trying to be achieved? So I think that's probably a good point for us now to transition our discussion to that table and to start mapping out what an answer might look like. So I'll share my screen.
Excuse me, Jacob. And
yeah, of course.
What about freedom of movement or association? Should we invoke a Kruger case here?
Yeah. So thinking
when we don't have an implication in the constitution of this freedom as such, but rather referring to Kruger case, I could say that this is free society and representative democracy, which may entail freedom of movement and association.
Yes. So sorry, yeah, that's a good point. I missed that one. So thinking about I suppose the ability to congregate in informing the protest, but also thinking about Section 4 of the Act, which basically makes it an offence for a person to form or be a member of an association that has among its objectives the promotion or appreciation of tobacco, alcohol, or prayer grass. Absolutely. So thinking about the implied freedom to associate and move. Absolutely. We can raise those as well. So we've got a few issues to run through, and we'll see how we go for time. We might get through them all. But let's basically just sort of break them down into so there's the Section 3 issue of broadcasting material. We've got the section 4 association. And then we've got section 10 of the Public Safety Act, which is the marching. And then we've got the ideas around defamation as well that we'll need to think about as well. So let's work through them. We'll see how far we go. Under the structured proportionality approach, which, as I've said, is currently the preferred approach, the first things that we need to be doing is thinking about what's the object or what's the purpose of the legislation, and then thinking about what's the burden, what burden does it impose on the implied freedom of political communication. So let's think about section 3 first. There'll be a lot of commonality between these, but section 3, what's the purpose? What's a section 3 try and achieve here? Okay, so it seems like I froze for a little bit there. So basically, we're going to, as a first step, look through the as a first step under structured proportionality, think about what's the purpose of the legislation, what's it trying to achieve, and then what burden does it place on the implied freedom? Those are our two kind of overarching questions. So firstly, what's section 3? What's the purpose? What's it trying to achieve here?
To limit the advertising of tobacco, alcohol, and the grass.
Yeah, so that's I suppose what it does. Why do you think the government or the Minister for Communications is keen to try and do that?
Because it's a harmful substance.
Yeah. Anything else or anything that we'd add to that?
Protect public health.
Yes, yeah. So and we're drawing this from the Minister for Communications comments, and we don't necessarily have to take that absolutely at face value, but at least on the surface, the idea is to protect public health by restricting the sale restricting the broadcasting of advertisements and discussion or promotion of these harmful substances. So that's what they say they're trying to achieve. What burden does it place on members of the public? And I think maybe judging by the silence, we might be overthinking this one. The burden is it restricts free political communication. About I'll just say the substances, but these various products. It's in preventing advertisement and discussion of these products, necessarily the ability to freely communicate about those substances and the political issues that surround them is reduced, right? So that's I suppose the framing context for our consideration of these sections. Now, what I think we'll do and if you hadn't guessed already that I'm not the biggest fan of the structured proportionality approach, that will be much clearer now. I think it will be clearer for you if we go with the Lang test first, and then talk about the structured proportionality, because I think it gets us at a clearer understanding of what's going on. So in an exam or answering a question, my recommendation would be you talk about McCloy and structured proportionality first, and then bring up the previous test and discuss how that might change your perspective or change your answer. But in terms of planning the answer itself, I would suspect that you'll have an easier time working through the Lang test first, and then that can inform the way that you think about structured proportionality. If structured proportionality works for you, by all means, use that approach. But I think that most people find Lang a bit easier to work through in the first instance. So we'll try that for section 3, and then we might reverse it for section 4 and see. You can decide for yourself which works better for you. So under Lang, first question we need to ask ourselves is, does the law burden the implied freedom? Yes, we've just discussed that it does. The second question is the law aimed at a legitimate objective? And so what we're thinking about here is the objective, which we've identified is around public health and restricting discussion and advertisement and promotion of these substances. Is that objective legitimate in the sense that it's necessary or important or useful for a thriving and healthy democracy? So what do we think about that? We know that the minister says that they're concerned about public health, but is it legitimate to limit discussion of this particular issue?
Not necessarily, I would say.
Okay, and why would that be?
Because I think about restricting people not getting their voice out. That's what I feel like, and I think it's very important for any democracy that people should be in favor and opposition, just to balance out. But just shutting them, I think it's I wouldn't say it's a healthy for any country or any democracy. That's what I feel like.
Okay. What I might do, I'll just sort of collate. Maybe there'll be diverse views. I'll just sort of jot everything down. So we want to hear about diverse opinions or perspectives. Yep. Anyone else?
I would go even further by saying that there are alternative professional opinions to the contrary of the government's view.
Okay, and so like looking at what the president of the Alternate Medicine Association,
Yes.
The fact that she's come out and said, I actually think that there's some benefit to this stuff, indicates that there is something more to be had. So
in a sense that they're not only diverse, but they're contrary to the governmental opinion.
Okay, yep. So diverse and yep.
It is a legitimate objective, I believe, but it's also it's a very general statement. We want to protect public health. What exactly do they mean by that? I think that if they wanted to create a law, to look after public health, they'd have to kind of narrow it down and go into specifics.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is skipping ahead a little bit to the numbering.
Yeah, sorry.
Messed up, but no. That's good. That's good. I'm just so sort of what you'd say is that there is a legitimate objective in the sense that we public health is important, and if if there's evidence that these substances are problematic, then it's legitimate for the government to protect citizens by restricting their ability to access these products or find out about these products, be advertised to in relation to these products. But in terms of what the actual content of Section 3 does, you're taking issue with, I guess, the way that they've done about it. You're saying that the exact implementation under Section 3 isn't reasonably appropriate and adapted to that objective. That's kind of the direction you're going there.
Yes, that's it. I guess that it sort of comes back to the whole, in my head, I was thinking like, we all know that smoking tobacco, there's a risk to it. But, if the government really did want to do something about it, surely they ban smoking or they ban like consumption of certain products.
Yeah. We'll return to this idea of reasonably appropriate and adapted, but just for now, thinking about.
Oh yeah, of course. Sorry.
No. I'm more sort of explaining what I'm typing. But so at the moment we're thinking that it's a bit vague or a bit broad, and so what it's trying to do is even though yes, the public should be protected from this information or this stuff, they haven't gone about it in the right way, essentially.
Yes,
I mean, it's interesting. There's the government for real is at the moment undergoing its next wave of trying to restrict and regulate the way that smoking products are advertised, and then trying to expand that to vaping products as well. So it's very much a live issue. The other thing that we can sort of think about around this kind of what's the objective and whether that objective is legitimate or not is focusing on the public health is an important one and a useful one. But we might also think about whether there's nuance to be had here. Sorry, did I freeze then?
Frozen? Yes, that's right.
Sorry. So the other thing that we might think about in relation to the objective is whether there's nuance to be had in terms of public health. That's pretty broad, and whether there should actually be some sort of nuance or distinction made here. So, for example, the health of children or young people who might be more susceptible to the advertising and that sort of stuff. Whether protecting children or young people is a legitimate objective, whereas protecting mostly or hopefully rational full adults might then not necessarily be a legitimate objective. So having some nuance and some distinguishing between what's the core of the objective and what's trying to be achieved, we can potentially break that down a little bit as well. I think drawing out a broader lesson for the exam, I wouldn't mind necessarily which way you went. If you said that it was aimed at a legitimate objective or if it wasn't, what I'd be interested in is the way that you reasoned through that. Let's say that it is aimed at a legitimate objective. What do we think about it being reasonably appropriate and adapted? We've heard already that it might be too broad or too vague. What do other people think about that? So now we're I suppose for the purposes of the discussion, we accept that yes, protecting public health is fair enough and is a good enough reason to restrict people's ability to communicate on this issue. Now we're thinking about, okay, have they executed it properly? Have they gone about it in in an appropriate way.
I guess they're not very clear about their objectives. I'm not sure what they're trying to achieve by doing restriction. I understand they try to maybe not encourage people to go on taking the smoking, but again, how is it a data backed by, or what is they trying to achieve by? I'm not sure in that perspective.
I'd say that's still taking issue with the objective rather than necessarily taking issue with the way that they've gone about it, because that's, you know, as I understand it, maybe I'm misunderstanding the argument, but it's the way that sounds to me is that your concern is, you know, is there actually any evidence that the prairie grass is bad for you, and that people should be protected from hearing about this stuff? That goes to the objective. Are they should they be trying to restrict this stuff, rather than taking issue with, okay, have they gone about restricting it in a way that's reasonable or adapted?
Correct. Yeah.
I'd say probably not for me, Jacob. Anyway, reasonably appropriate and adapted. I think, like, overall, if your objective was to protect public health, it's quite severe punishment, and I think it's quite wide in its scope of who it can target. I think, you know, if we're looking at no person shall broadcast, you know, on any platform, including the internet, any information that pertains to tobacco, alcohol, or this grass. And if you do that, you're punishable with a fine up to 100,000. I mean, it could just include anything, you know, especially with the use of social media these days. Any kind of broadcasting of maybe just someone engaging in that act could fall under that. I just think it's quite, it's quite a wide scope. Section 4 as well. I mean, I know we're talking about Section 3, but just overall.
Yeah.
Being a member of, or you know, of its objective, like, you know, what about, I don't know, just, yeah, there's too.
Yeah, no, those are fair points, and I think the raising the breadth of it is a useful point, because I think you could probably make the argument that so the restriction applies to any advertisement, information, or matter that pertains to sale and consumption of the products. You could potentially, I think you could make an argument that restricting the advertisement is fine, if we accept that there's a public interest in actually stopping people. You know, if there's a legitimate public health concern here, I think you could say that, well, you probably shouldn't be advertising this stuff because it's bad for people. But to broaden it out to information or any matter that pertains to it, that then covers a whole range of other discussions, and in particular, the types of political communication that the implied right aims to protect. What's interesting too is that it would cover discussion of the downsides or the health problems that arise from this stuff as well, right? If you said you know, smoking is bad for you, technically that's still information or a matter that pertains to the consumption of tobacco. So you're trying to actually, what you're trying to do is in line with the objectives, yet it would still be impermissible under the Act. So I think we would have a really strong argument here that the law is not reasonably appropriate and adapted. It's too broad, it's too vague, it covers such a wide range of communication that doesn't get at the core idea of we've got a public health interest in this, and we're taking issue with the consumption of these products. Stopping people from talking about whether it's healthy or not. I think we'd have a good argument that goes too far. Any other quick comments? Because I'm keen for us to now jump over to structured proportionality as well. Anyone?
Yes,
Yeah,
I have one. It is not reasonably adapted, also in the sense that it gives unnecessary competitive advantage to paper mass media, not electronic ones. And paper media are not restrained by this act, and therefore the ultimate purpose of protecting public health wouldn't be achieved, as those types of media would be capable to disseminate this information.
Okay, so sort of going the other way in the sense that if we accept that the public health stuff needs to be that we need to restrict discussion of this issue, then you actually need to go all the way and prevent all media.
Rather than giving unnecessary competitive advantage to only one type of media.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think potentially where I can definitely see where you're going from. The competitive advantage or the sort of the commercial element of it, I wouldn't think would have a strong weight. But this idea of it's not a complete restriction, if you were determined to get this message out there, you could still use print media. That's a really good point, because that I can see that being an argument that actually goes in favor of this being reasonably appropriate and adapted, in the sense that the government could argue, look, we're not shutting down this conversation completely, we're just restricting where it happens. And so there was a case in 2017 or 2018, Clubb and Edwards, which involved, there was sort of a safe zone around health centers where women could get abortions. And so there was a sort of a safe zone where you couldn't protest and it applied to both sides. So pro-choice and anti-abortion people both couldn't, within 150 meters of the entrance of these health centers, couldn't protest on these issues. And what was important in that case, so that legislation was upheld. It was found that that was that didn't infringe the implied freedom of political communication. And what was important in the reasoning there was that it didn't completely shut down communication. You could go 151 meters away and have the conversation or have the protest there. And so the court was able to point to all these other public spaces where people could still have their voice heard, could still communicate the political messages that they want to. And as a result, they were willing to say that wasn't too big a burden, or that wasn't an illegitimate burden. So I think it's a really good point. I can see a scenario where it actually goes the other way and strengthens the argument to say that it is reasonably appropriate and adapted. Maybe it wouldn't get up, but I can see it kind of cutting that way, which is really interesting. And now we've only got a couple of minutes left, so let's jump across to structured proportionality and just highlight the differences here. So in terms of thinking about whether the law is suitable, whether it's rationally connected to a legitimate purpose, we're drawing across these ideas that we've talked about earlier in terms of, is the law aimed at a legitimate objective? So a lot of that is the same, but the difference is that we're drawing this rational connection, whereas under the Lang test, we're just looking at whether the objective itself is legitimate or not. And so under the first step of structured proportionality, our focus is what's the purpose, what's the objective, but we're also, to a degree, it's drawing in these ideas about whether it's reasonably appropriate, adapted, although not really. But we're trying to add in this layer of, is there a connection between these two things? Or is there a rational connection between these two things? And so that's sort of an extra layer that we don't get under the Lang test. Similarly, in terms of is the law necessary? So this is looking at, are there other means, or could you get at this objective via a different route? Could you achieve the same thing without burdening the freedom? Again, these are potentially ideas that we're thinking about in terms of the reasonably appropriate and adapted step. Sorry, I froze up again there. So did I make it all the way through? Is the law suitable?
No, I think
Okay.
you only started, I think.
Right. Okay. No worries. So we've got, is the law suitable? And that draws on some of the ideas that we've talked about under Lang in terms of, is it aimed at a legitimate objective? Is there a legitimate purpose? But we're adding in this extra layer of, is there a rational connection between these two things? So in the context of this scenario, we're talking about the purpose being public health, and the concerns that we raised in this discussion around, is it right for the government to be imposing itself in this space? That all applies. But then on top of that, we're asking these questions around, well, do you actually need to restrict people's ability to advertise or have these discussions in order to achieve that purpose? Next, in terms of, is the law necessary? So this is looking for, are there any alternatives or reasonable alternatives that could achieve the same end, but wouldn't burden the implied freedom, or wouldn't be as burdensome? So potentially some of the ideas that we talked about in terms of, do you just limit it to a discussion of, does it affect, do we restrict it advertising to children, or do we limit it to just advertising but not discussion or information or any matter? Those kinds of ideas we might raise in terms of the necessity. And then lastly, in terms of, is the law adequate in its balance? Fundamentally, it's still the same idea. Is it reasonably appropriate and adapted? Is it adequate in its balance? We're undertaking a weighing and evaluation of the competing perspectives. But the difference is that, having been through these ideas of, is it suitable, and is it necessary, the thinking or the argument is that this analysis about whether it's adequate in its balance should become easier or clearer. Whether that ultimately is the case, I leave it up to you to decide. But you'll be drawing on the same points and the same ideas around, have they gone about it in a way that is useful or achieves its objectives in a way that minimizes the impact on the implied freedom. It's weighing up, how important is people's public health versus how important is it for people to be able to discuss these issues. That's where all of that discussion comes into play. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, you arrive at a position where in an exam, what I'd be looking for, I wouldn't mind, as I said before, I wouldn't mind if you came out as saying it's not adequate in its balance, or it is adequate in its balance. What I'm looking for is that reasoning and that discussion and that evaluation of the arguments for and against. That's how you showcase your critical analysis and your skills in this space. Any quick questions or comments on that one? No, that's all good. I'm conscious that we've ticked past 8 o'clock. Just super quickly, in terms of association, largely the same objectives and ideas. So broadly, you'd expect to see the same format. Obviously, the arguments themselves are slightly different, but in terms of section 4 and section 10, going through those same steps, and it might be the case that you can use these tables as practice going through those sections. Just lastly, very quickly, thinking about defamation, and in particular, sort of looking at whether the implied freedom or qualified privilege can be a defense to defamation. What we're looking for here is to establish that it's on a political matter, which I think we could safely argue. Was it disseminated to a wide audience? Yes, it was broadcast on TV, as I understand. Was it reasonable? That, I don't know. You could argue that one either way, I think. And then, was it not malicious? Again, in the heat of the moment, the comments were interesting, and so I think you might have. Again, you could go either way, arguing whether it was malicious or not. But so it's important about having that discussion, raising those arguments for and against. But overall, the key thing to be thinking about in terms of the implied freedom of political communication is that we're not just looking at is there a burden? Oh, there's a burden, therefore it must be bad, and we have to junk it. It's going through this evaluative process of how do we weigh up what the government is trying to achieve by putting the burden on political communication, and we've got structural proportionality, or we've got the appropriateness, or is it reasonably appropriate and adapted as frameworks for helping us engage in that evaluation. It's framing our discussion and our consideration in that space. So just being really, really considerate and deliberate in the way that we discuss those things, rather than just saying, oh, well, we've got an implied freedom of political communication. This law burdens it, therefore it must be bad. We've got to go through an extra step. We will leave it there. Next week, we've got week 12, talking about constitutional change. Don't worry too much about the tutorial questions for next week. I've made space for us to have a chat about the voice, but I think given that the referendum's coming up very soon, I think it's actually more useful for us to just have some time to discuss the voice itself and the proposal and those sorts of things, rather than being constrained by the tutorial questions. So don't worry too much about that. And then the other big thing for next week, we're going to go through lots of exam prep and revision of the content from the past few weeks. So looking forward to that discussion. If you've got topics or questions that you'd really like me to cover next week, please email them through, and I'll make sure that we've got time for that as well. But other than that, thank you all very much for coming along, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.